This is Pacifica Radio's Letters and Politics. On today's show,
and Ed underwent vigorous physical rehabilitation, on and on and on, but he made no progress. And he watched the people around him. Most made some progress, and most, often using canes, crutches, etc., braces, most walked out. And that was the victorious moment. That was the you won the Super Bowl moment, is when someone walked out of the unit to go back home. Of course, that doesn't tell you the rest of the story. It was very hard for those people when they got home to an accessible society.
But it's a triumphant moment that these people are experiencing.
It was a triumph, and Ed watched it over and over and over, and he made no progress at all. I think that he knew in the hospital he was going to, and this is much of what the story is about, he was going to have to invent himself. He was going to have to adapt to the society that essentially said he was invalid.
A conversation with Scot Danforth, who has just published the first biography on the disability rights icon Ed Roberts. It's called An Independent Man, Ed Roberts and the Fight for Disability Rights. That's next on Letters and Politics. But first, the news.
For Pacifica Radio, I'm Scott Baba. The Rafah border crossing between Gaza and Egypt will remain closed through at least tomorrow, reducing the flow of aid into the Palestinian enclave, Israeli officials said today. In a statement, the Israeli government body known as Coordination of Government Activities in the Territories, or COGAT, said Hamas had violated the agreement by not releasing the bodies of dead Israeli hostages, and Israel would be imposing sanctions as a result. COGAT said that only 300 of the agreed 600 aid trucks will be allowed to enter the territory, and all of them will belong to the UN and humanitarian NGOs with no private sector involvement. It also said that no fuel or gas will be allowed into the strip except for specific needs related to humanitarian infrastructure. Hamas did release the bodies of 4 dead Israeli captives on Monday and told mediators it plans to transfer the bodies of 4 more deceased Israeli hostages to Israel at 10 p.m. local time today. Hamas has previously said that recovering the bodies of some hostages could take longer, citing the difficulty of locating burial sites amid the widespread rubble in Gaza. Meanwhile, in Gaza, the health ministry said today that the bodies of 3 people killed by the Israeli military in the northern part of the territory were taken to Al-Ali Hospital. The Israeli military said troops there had, quote, opened fire to remove the threat of several people approaching them and not complying with orders to stop. It didn't immediately comment on any casualties. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said Russian forces have launched powerful glide bombs and drones against Kharkiv and hit a hospital. Officials said that the attack on Ukraine's second-largest city wounded 7 people and forced the evacuation of 50 patients at the hospital. Zelensky said today that the main targets were energy facilities. The assault is part of Russia's ongoing campaign to disable Ukraine's power supply. Zelensky is set to meet with U.S. President Donald Trump in Washington this week to seek more American military support, including air defense systems. Sagar Magani reports.
Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky says he'll visit Washington this week for talks on the U.S. potentially providing his military long-range weapons. Zelensky says he may meet with President Trump as soon as Friday.
The main topics are air defense and our possibilities with long range to pressure on Russia.
His remarks during a meeting with the European Union's foreign affairs chief came after what Zelensky said was a very productive call with President Trump Sunday. The president later told reporters on Air Force One he may send Kyiv long-range Tomahawk missiles if Russia does not settle the war soon.
Do they want to have Tomahawks going in their direction?
Tomahawks would let Ukraine strike deeper into Russian territory. Vladimir Putin has said supplying them to Ukraine would seriously damage U.S.-Russian relations. Sagar Magani, Washington.
House Speaker Mike Johnson defended the Trump administration's move to use Pentagon funds not allocated for the purpose to pay military members during the government shutdown. Johnson said the administration has, quote, every right to reallocate funds from research and development accounts to the Department of Defense to ensure service members receive their October 15th paychecks. The Pentagon and Office of Management and Budget says this temporary shift means a separate funding bill isn't needed for now. Democrats have questioned the legality of the move, but Johnson dismissed their concerns, saying he is grateful for a commander-in-chief who, quote, understands the priorities of the country. Meanwhile, Johnson is still refusing to call lawmakers back to Washington, and President Donald Trump's budget director is vowing to keep firing federal workers. Edwin J. Vieira reports.
The government shutdown is in its third week with little sign of movement from either side. The House is in recess until October 19th, and Speaker Mike Johnson says he won't call members back into session without stopgap funding. Polls show Democratic demands for extending Affordable Care Act subsidies and reversing megabill Medicaid cuts are extremely popular. Johnson acknowledges healthcare needs major reforms, but says Obamacare has failed the American people.
It was promised to be a great success, to make healthcare more affordable. It's done exactly the opposite. And it has been pointed out by everyone that since Obamacare was created in 2010, premiums, the cost of healthcare, have risen exponentially.
Premiums have actually risen more slowly since the ACA became law. A KFF analysis shows insurance on the exchange would cost the average American 75% more in 2026, partially due to the pandemic-era subsidies expiring. New York's Department of Health expects costs for the 140,000 people who use the exchange to rise by nearly 40% without the tax credits, while a separate state plan providing care for almost 2 million consumers would also expire. Amy Lee Pashock with Stony Brook University Hospital says it'll be like a bomb going off.
We think the public at large doesn't recognize what's happening. They're in some sort of dystopia. Our expectation is in December, January, February, our hospitals are going to be overrun with people who can no longer afford the care they need in the outpatient setting.
She hopes the state uses disproportionate share hospital payments to cover some of the gap for public hospitals with a high number of low-income patients. I'm Edwin J. Vieira for Pacifica Network and Public News Service.
The New York Times, the Associated Press, and the conservative television network Newsmax are among 5 outlets who said yesterday that they won't sign a new Defense Department document about its new press rules. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's team has said that reporters who don't sign on to their new rules will be thrown out of the Pentagon tomorrow if they don't agree. The new rules declare large swaths of the Pentagon off limits to reporters and declares that journalists who report information not formally approved by Hegseth's team risk getting their access revoked. The Pentagon says the rules are, quote, common sense. Journalists say they punish routine news gathering. I'm Scott Baba for Pacifica Radio.
Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. I want to begin today's program by thanking everyone who has donated to their public radio station. I've always said how much I admire people who give for something that they could get for free, and to do it without a lot of recognition. You are like that person who does this really nice thing out in public, and the only one reason that people know about it is because some security video camera caught you doing it, and then somebody put it online, and it went viral. But even with this, donating to this radio station, you don't even get to have that kind of viral experience or recognition, but you gave anyways. And it is instructive to me that the real value is how we live our life, and not the recognition that we may receive for it. That the path itself is what life is, not the destination. You've given me an important lesson, and I do thank you. I do want to also tell you that my home station came up about $30,000 short from the overall goal, and I'm sure all the radio stations that air this program could use a little more support in these trying times for public broadcasting. So I want to tell you, you could still go to your radio station's website and make that contribution if you have yet to do so. And I do thank you. Well, friends, we are now in the final week that I will be hosting this radio program, Letters and Politics. Again, I'm not being pushed out, nor am I disgruntled. I am leaving on my own accord with a great sense of gratitude for the station and for you. And as I've previously said, no one ever really leaves their community radio station. I'll still be around and probably do special broadcasts here and there. This is my community, and I am not giving that up. In fact, I probably don't have a choice in that matter. I am going to be at least trying, to work on my own storytelling projects. If you would like to stay in touch, you can always find me on social media. I'm also doing a podcast that I'm just experimenting with. We'll see where it goes and what it becomes. It's called Letters from Mitch. I call it that because that's exactly what it is, a letter from me to you. And in that letter, I will always leave a story. Today, here shortly, I will be uploading a new episode to Letters from Mitch. It's about a Buddhist ghost story that I think is instructive. Again, you can find the podcast on most podcast platforms by just searching for Letters from Mitch. I also have a Substack column that contains the audio of the podcast, as well as a transcript and some of my own photos and art. You can just look for Mitch Jeserich on Substack. If you subscribe, then you'll get an email whenever I publish a newsletter, which won't be multiple times a day, I promise. Probably it won't be daily either. My last name, again, is spelled just as it sounds, though no one ever in my life has ever spelled it correctly. There are no Z's and there are no double S's. It's just Jeserich. Jeserich. Today we bring you a conversation about the life of Ed Roberts, oftentimes considered the founder of the disability rights movement. My guest is Scot Danforth, who has written a biography on Ed Roberts. Shockingly, but perhaps not so shockingly, but should be shocking, there has never been a biography about Ed Roberts or any of the founders of the disability rights movement. I have long argued on this radio program that the disability rights movement should be seen as a key moment in history in creating a more inclusive society and a more inclusive democratic system. The fact that it's not just illegal to discriminate against disabled people, but also architectural barriers had to be removed to ensure that disabled folks can fully participate in civic life is remarkable, and is something I've never seen in the history of studying civilizations, at least not large ones. Not only did it revolutionize what it meant to be in civic society, it also had a profound impact on architecture itself and made architecture inclusive. Scot Danforth is the Jack H. and Paula A. Hassinger Chair in Education and Professor of Disability Studies at Chapman University. He's the author of the biography An Independent Man, Ed Roberts and the Fight for Disability Rights. Scot Danforth, it's a great pleasure, sir. Thank you for taking the time.
Thanks, Mitch. I'm happy to be with you.
You just had to listen to me opine about my thoughts about the significance of the disability rights movement. You've written extensively about it, including about its founder, Ed Roberts. Can you talk to me, and disagree with anything I said, of course, but can you talk to me about what you think the significance just in civic life that the disability rights movement has had?
Oh, wow. I think I'll follow on your wonderful intro. Disability is interesting because we tend to assume that it's about someone else. We tend to assume that it's about someone you don't know. And yet, what Ed Roberts and others have taught us, disability is about everybody. If you're not disabled today, if you are lucky enough to live long enough, you will be at some point. And in the meantime, if you don't have a disability, you undoubtedly have a loved one or a family member who does. This is truly everyone. And as Ed liked to say, unlike other sort of marginalized groups, um, you're unlikely to wake up tomorrow morning belonging to a minoritized racial group if you don't belong to one today. But you could be disabled at any moment. Life works that way. Impairments happen naturally and mysteriously. So this really is a challenge to our society in terms of who do we allow in? Who gets to participate? Who gets to count? Who gets to be respected? And it really challenges us to think about the lines that we draw around acceptability and inclusivity. So in that sense, I think that your intro really hits it where this is the movement. It's the movement people know less about out of all the civil rights movements, but it's the one that is about everyone.
It was very different before this movement existed for disabled people. Historically, throughout all history, it was very different.
Yes, yes, I would say. And so when if you think of Ed Roberts, teenager, contracts polio in the mid 50s, the assumption was, and I know this will sound really ugly and strange to us, but the assumption was that someone in his shoes had two pathways. One was to overcome, and I put that in quotes, their disability in a dramatic way, some sort of rehabilitation where they're cured, and that was pretty rare. And the other one was to accept a second class or third class citizen status and just be weak and ill and stay out of the way. Accept that you're really, you're going to keep breathing, but you're really not going to have a life in this society.
Ed Roberts was born on January 23rd, 1939. He was not born disabled, and I want to talk to you about his youth. But before we get there, I actually want to kind of get into the meat of our conversation about Ed Roberts the same way you started with your book. You didn't start with his birth or his early childhood. You started with Ed Roberts in college at UC Berkeley, and it was fascinating because it was just a wild story. Ed Roberts in college. When did Ed Roberts go to college, and was he the first sort of physically disabled person, at least in a wheelchair, to go to college at UC Berkeley?
So he entered as an undergraduate in 1962. The story is often told that he was the first, but there's no reason to believe that. In fact, he showed up, and the first thing the administrators told him when he went to register for class was they looked at the man in the wheelchair and they said, well, we tried cripples before and this didn't work. So somebody else had come before him. I think what was important was he, by the late 60s, so he finished his undergraduate degree. He was in the PhD program in poli-sci. By the late 60s, he and a group of his friends, I mean, there was a whole team of people who used wheelchairs and had physical disabilities. They were all living in the campus hospital. I know that sounds like a strange place to have your dormitory, but that's where the university put them. But that gave them a place to unite and a place to come together and have these late night rap sessions where they came to realize, gee, what's happened to me is not about me. They depersonalized their experiences and politicized them. They realized this is happening to all of us. There's something going on out there. And that was by 1968, 1969.
Tell me more about this hospital that they lived in there as it was a dormitory.
Yes, Cowell Hospital, third floor. There was an empty floor on. It's unusual to have a sort of infirmary on campus for students, but Cal had that back then. The building's no longer there. And so they were housed in a hospital ward. But it gave them, oddly enough, they didn't like that, the segregation, but on the other hand, they liked that they were thrown together, and there was a whole group of people who either had polio or had say diving accidents and back injuries, and these students came together really at a opportune moment if you think about the history of Berkeley and Cal. I mean, the campus was raging with protests from Vietnam to the People's Park. I mean, it was just on and on and on. It was a hotbed of political activism. It was an ideal time for a group of young people with disabilities to start asking each other, is our circumstance political too? Are we held back not just by our bodies, but by the political arrangements out in the world? And shouldn't we be out there protesting?
And these are young people, and they're kind of running amok on the third floor of the hospital, aren't they? As young people would do.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. It was, and I think that was exciting for many of them. So many of uh, the group, they named themselves the Rolling Quads. So many of the Rolling Quads had spent a lot of their childhood in hospitals. John Hessler, who was Ed's partner in this activity, had spent 5 years on a back ward of a hospital just wasting away. And to suddenly be reclaimed out of this and thrown onto the incredibly dynamic campus of Cal in the late 60s was to be put in a place where politics, the sexual revolution, alcohol, drugs, I mean, it was just a very exciting place to be young and to experiment.
And they're sneaking marijuana and drugs and alcohol into the hospital, into the
Yes,
third
yes.
floor, and this is causing problems with.
Well, it definitely caused problems because it was arranged that the personal attendants or personal assistants in the hospital was the nursing staff, and the nursing staff did not like all of this wild stuff that was going on. It just wasn't what they thought they signed up for. Um, Ed was very good at winning them over. That was one of his talents, was he had big dark eyes, and he was a great listener, and he could win people over. But even with that, the nursing staff was just overwhelmed by this sort of party scene.
And a couple of these students then were facing expulsion.
Yeah, there were two students who the key was that the entire arrangement was funded and operated by the California Department of Rehabilitation. Now think ahead a few years. In 1975, Ed would become the head of that department under Jerry Brown's first administration. But back at this point, that department was in charge of this wing of the hospital and in charge of their funding. And they kicked two of the students out for not attending class on a regular basis, for not buckling down. And I mean, the rehab people didn't understand what these students were doing. They thought that this was a form of rehabilitation. So they kicked two of the students out, and that turned into a reason for all the students to come together and to protest and fight back. The reason I start the book with that, it was Ed's first fight, his first big fight. How about that? He had had some earlier tussles, but his first big political fight. It's arguably the beginning of the disability rights movement. Judy Human's activity with Disabled in Action on the East Coast came a little bit later, less than a year later. Um,
Independently?
but
Did it independently come?
Yes, independently. It's interesting because Judy Human, Ed recruited her within a couple years to come out to Berkeley and join the Berkeley activism squad. Really, this one way to view my book is my book is um, Berkeley beats the world would be another title. I mean, it was Berkeley activism carried out by a bunch of disabled, young people that took on the whole world. And yes, so Ed recruited Judy Human to come and be, an important part of that. But at that time, it was just originally it was just a group of Cal students.
There was also this alliance where they also, you mentioned the nurses and the nurses' objections in the hospital of these young college students doing what young college students do. But there was also, were there personal attendants that these folks had who were also students
That's
that were largely gay?
It's interesting. There was they had to recruit personal attendants. So you think of personal attendants for someone like Ed Roberts, who was um, paralyzed, not completely, but mostly from the neck down. Um, he, he needed assistance, to get up in the morning, get bathed, have breakfast, etc. So there are lots of kinds of care that had to happen, and so they would hire personal attendants. Now these people, um, yes, there was you think of who ended up in those jobs. A lot of people who who were conscientious objectors to Vietnam. This was a form of service. You had a high number of LGBT Q folks. I mean, they were sort of people on Berkeley had a lot of people living alternative on alternative pathways of life, and that tended to attract those people. But it also it made that scene in the hospital even more exciting because every disabled student there needed a couple of workers to help them. And so if you have, say, 11 students in there, now you add on all the workers. I mean, it just made for a very vibrant scene of people with and without disabilities.
In your book, you made this connection that I found interesting, though, between sort of LGBTQ folks and disabled folks. And of course, disabled folks could be gay, lesbian, transgender, bisexual as well, and are. But you did sort of make this connection of, both are usually the people within these groups are usually, the one within the family that's either gay or disabled, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I think so that I think there's a parallel there that you just pointed out, which is so to be you know, the gay son in the family or to be the disabled young man in the family, it's different than when you grow up, let's say, think about the African American civil rights movement. I mean, if you were a black young man, it's more than likely your parents are too. But with disability and with with sexuality, you can be in a minoritized group and then your family isn't. You're the one who's different. And that can lead to a lot of misunderstandings. And in the best situations, you get family support, which Ed did, but not always. Not always.
And Ed did. His mom, Zona Roberts, is a force in of herself.
Yes. So Zona only passed away in the last year, over 100 years old.
In Berkeley.
Yes, Ed's mother Zona, his father Vern. His father Vern died while he was in college, but definitely an important supportive figure in his youth. But his mom was the one who taught him how to fight, which is really amazing because at least at that point in Ed's life, say Ed as a teenager, Zona was a small, gentle woman who she told me she was not comfortable with anger.
Yeah, I was
And she
surprised
had
to
to,
read. I was surprised to read. You also said that she was conflict averse.
yes. I mean, her husband Vern even more so. He basically stayed in the background. She really did not. But she did not like conflict. She did not want to take people on. She didn't view it as who she was, but she viewed it as necessary. That it's a little bit of that when you're pushed up against the wall, what are you going to do? And she was taking care of Ed when Ed was a teenager, 18 months in two hospitals, comes home, he's in an iron lung, he's in the family living room, and Zona realized as long as Ed is here in the home, I am too. I am trapped like he is. And they were unified in that. Now, there's also sort of a feminist tale to her side, which was that she had felt sort of trapped already. Her husband Vern, did not want her to go to college, did not want her to work. He wanted her to stay at home, the 1950s style housewife. She wanted to get out. She wanted to travel across Europe, which she did later in life. She wanted to do things. She ended up later in the story going to Cal herself. Um, so she wanted to break out, and she viewed the two of them breaking loose as parallels and as linked. So she pushed Ed. She pushed Ed to get out.
Ed Roberts.
In part for herself, you know.
Ed Roberts was not born disabled. He contracted polio, which in this time so many kids did.
It was a scary thing through, all the way up through the, the mid 50s when the vaccines came out, and it was a summer scare. It was a warm weather. Everyone knew somebody in the early 50s. Everyone knew some child who ended up in the hospital, who ended up paralyzed and maybe coming home on crutches, or some children died. I point out in the book, though, that what frightened families more was the children who lived, because the idea of being paralyzed was viewed in that time, in that culture, as even more frightening, as a sort of a living death.
You're making me think here, and making a connection that I haven't always made. You know, with the gay rights movement, the HIV/AIDS epidemic was such an important moment. It sounds like the polio epidemic. Like, I don't know if we do get a disability rights movement without the polio epidemic.
Yeah, you're really onto something there. So even think of some of the leaders: Ed Roberts, Judy Heumann, Justin Dart Jr. Later on, Justin Dart was the Texas Republican who was inside the administration, inside that George H.W. Bush administration in the late 80s, the leader who was organizing both parties. I know it sounds strange, but in the late 80s, two parties worked together to get things done. But all three of those, and many, many more of the leaders were people who had polio. So it was a big part historically of the foundation of the movement.
Well, George H.W. Bush, the father, is the one who signed the Americans with Disabilities Act into law. This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with Scot Danforth. Scot Danforth is the author of the biography An Independent Man, Ed Roberts and the Fight for Disability Rights. Scot Danforth, you spent a lot of time on Ed Roberts as a kid in the hospital. And this is interesting because a lot of kids with disabilities spend a lot of time in the hospital. Tell me about Ed Roberts' time in the hospital.
So a teenager, and within less than a week, he goes from being a boy who's racing around the ball field to respiratory paralysis. So he's lying on his back. He's staring up at these lights. He can't move. He can't breathe without an iron lung. The iron lung is basically replacing the muscles in his diaphragm that make breathing happen. And I think for him, the most shocking part was the isolation and the loneliness. Hospitals back then were not very family friendly. They didn't communicate well with parents, and they had very strict rules about who could come visit. Ed did not see his siblings very often. He had brothers at home that he barely saw. And also, you think of the timing of it, being a teenager. It's just about when you're about to enter adolescence, and your life is going to move in what he hoped would be some very enjoyable directions. And instead, he was completely transformed, and a year and a half laying on his back. Now, the other piece to keep in mind is that these polio units, they were rehabilitation facilities. They put people in swimming pools. They had rehabilitation methods, from Sister Kinney, who's a nurse who came from Australia with all kinds of methods for rehabilitating the body. And Ed underwent vigorous physical rehabilitation, on and on and on, but he made no progress. And he watched the people around him, most made some progress, and most, often using canes, crutches, etc., braces, most walked out. And that was the victorious moment. That was the you won the Super Bowl moment, is when someone walked out of the unit to go back home. Of course, that doesn't tell you the rest of the story. It was very hard for those people when they got home, to an accessible society,
But it's a
inaccessible
triumphant
society.
moment that these people are
It
experiencing.
was a triumph, and Ed watched it over and over and over, and he made no progress at all. I think that he knew in the hospital he was going to, and this is much of what the story is about, he was going to have to invent himself. He was going to have to adapt to the society that essentially said he was invalid. He was not really alive. He was invisible. And he was going to have to come up with a way of a character, to put it that way. A character who was vibrant, who was outgoing, who was alive, and yet was paralyzed. And that was a brand new idea. He had no role model to look to. He had no place to look for that kind of, he couldn't say, I'm going to be like so and so. He had to really come up with this persona. And it took him years. I'm not saying this is over a weekend in the hospital. This took him years to really kind of cook up who he could be.
You mentioned invalid. I mean, disabled folks are commonly called invalids, which that's
Yes.
exactly what that means, invalid.
Yeah, and that was even years later. There's a great phrase. There's a really good photograph book by a photographer named Halin Dalil, and it's becoming real in 25 days, and that was about the 504 sit-ins at the federal building in San Francisco in 1977. But the idea of how someone with a disability who is essentially invisible and, as you noted, invalid, becomes real. And it was Ed and his friends viewed that as a yes, a psychological challenge, but a political challenge, something that you had to unite with your friends to rise up together.
So Ed was involved in the takeover of a federal building for about a month in San Francisco.
He was in at that time, so this is 1977, the two women who, and I one of the things I do in the book is I don't just tell Ed's stories, I tell the stories of the movement around him. And that action was coordinated by two people, activists in Berkeley, Kitty Cohn and Judy Heumann, and it brought together every kind of activist group in the whole Bay Area. And now Ed was more in the background. He made some manipulations and some strategic moves that really helped that happen and helped them win. But he wasn't the main leader in that action. But that was an important, if you think of over 3 weeks occupying a federal building in order to uh, force the Carter administration. The Carter administration did not want to sign the Section 504 law, the first anti-discrimination law in the United States, and the Carter administration did not want to enact it, to put it that way. I know we think of laws as being passed, and we think that then on Monday morning they just leap into presence in our lives, but it takes agencies and government activity to get laws actually started and set up and enforced. And for close to 4 years, no administration, Nixon, Ford, Carter, none of them wanted to do it. They all dodged it. So really, it was a Berkeley team, the Berkeley Center for Independent Living team, led by Kitty Cohn and Judy Heumann, who staged the action in San Francisco that ultimately defeated Carter and won that victory and help people feel real, to have that pride, to have that humanity.
I mean, I'm just thinking about the Carter administration and Carter refusing to sign this section of the Rehabilitation Act. And, you were laying out, and it's true, you just don't pass a law and it becomes law. You have to come up with regulations and how to implement and everything. But with this specifically, it is heavy lifting, right? I mean, you also have to, as far as possible, now physically make your buildings accessible or provide alternative ways to get people's services. I mean, it's not just you can't discriminate against disabled people. You also have to do some heavy lifting around architecture and these kind of things, which to me is a remarkable thing about the movement and why it's so important kind of in the democratic story.
Yeah, right. It's not just, although, I mean, Ed always would say that the biggest roadblock was attitudes. But if you think of what is actually out there in the world, what had to change, a lot of that was and continues to be architectural, the way buildings and the way features of the environment are set up. But it's also the way organizations run. If you think of employment issues and educational issues, I mean, right now we live in a moment where the the federal government just fired almost everybody in the Office of Special Education in Washington, D.C. So now there's no one to monitor the special education law. There's no one enforcing and making sure that kids with disabilities are receiving a special education. So there are lots of organizational and policy elements that have to be put in place. It's very complex to put it all together and to make it happen.
You mentioned Judy Heumann, somebody we've had on this show, died not too long ago. Kitty Cohn is a couple of the organizers around the 1977 takeover of federal building for almost a month. Were there rivalries between disability rights leaders? What was the relationship between like someone
Yes.
Judy Heumann and Ed
Yeah.
Roberts?
I think so later, so there's a point where yes, definitely. There I think the tensions here, I'll put it this way. Obviously, there's interpersonal rivalries about who's going to be in charge and who's going to be the big dog. Ed always, one of his strengths and weaknesses was that he always thought he was the biggest, not only on the national stage, but internationally, because he worked toward the development of Disabled Peoples International, which was the first international, worldwide disability activist group. But he always sort of over envisioned his role. He had an arrogance and a pushiness and an exuberance that helped him, but sometimes it was his weakness too. So yes, there was that, but I think the biggest issues were sort of the divisions in the country. So if you think about racial divisions or issues of sexism, I mean, definitely the movement was marred by sexism. There was an assumption that the men were running the show, and people like Judy Heumann, which you've met her. Judy was a force to be reckoned with. She was a powerful, uh, pushy person herself. She knew how to make things happen, but often the women were pushed to the lower roles of making the phone calls, handling the typewriters. There were not as many roles for, say, African Americans. I think the early Center for Independent Living struggled with that. It was the Berkeley Center was dominated in the 70s by white, young, physically disabled men who mostly went to Cal. And so if you
And
think of
we're
the
in
broader,
wheelchairs, and we're in wheelchairs
yes,
too, right?
more in wheelchairs, so there's a disability hierarchy there too. I'm not saying they didn't work on these things. They tried to bring in, the deaf community, the blind community, etc. And at their best, they did. But it was always a challenge to be inclusive, racially, in terms of gender, and also in terms of different disability types. I think those divisions were not just in the movement, they were in the country.
Your biography on Ed Roberts is not it's not just a hagiography. You do get into the complexities of who Ed Roberts was.
I wanted to make sure. One of the things when I started interviewing people, I interviewed dozens, is that I started hearing these sort of folk myth stories about this incredible, a little bit the way we talk about Martin Luther King. And then if you spend some time reading about Martin Luther King, you get to see the flaws. And it was that way with Ed. He was a flawed man. I try to make sure to show that it's not it's still he comes out he still comes out the hero of the story in many ways, but I wanted to make sure he was real. He was a man who got he was married and had a son. He was divorced. um there's a point in the story where he and his friends Judy Human and his right hand,
Well, let me ask about
sidekick.
getting the
Oh,
divorce
go ahead.
before we get in there.
Okay, go
I
ahead.
mean, was
Go
it
ahead.
just? I mean, is just divorce the bad thing itself, or was he sort of responsible for
It's
a
hard
wrecked
to
marriage?
anyone will tell you there's two people responsible for a failed marriage, but his wife Kathy went with him to Sacramento. I think Ed was a very, very busy guy all over the state, working for the state government. He wasn't home very much. She was lonely. She had an alcohol problem. They had a child, and that made things only more difficult. Eventually, her drinking, became worse. I think things just kind of fell apart. But he had definitely had a role in that. And then his son Lee did not grow up in his home, grew up in his ex-wife's home. He didn't get to see his son enough. I think he would always tell you that his son was the most important thing in his life. But he didn't spend all, he took his son on a lot of trips, but there were certainly questions about his parenting.
Did you talk to Lee for this book?
Actually, that was one of the I tried and tried and tried.
Lee
That
wouldn't
was
talk to you.
that he would not. And actually, the more I understood about the family, the more I understood why someone would not want to tell those insider stories. I tell them a little bit because I learned them. I'm sure he could have told me more. It would have changed the book, and I'm not sure it would have changed it for the better. Um, those are not the main stories, but it does show you different sides of Ed, the man and his family who had some real struggles.
But you did talk to other family members. You talked to Zona
Oh
Roberts,
yes,
his
yes. Oh,
mom. Yeah.
definitely Zona and
Yeah.
his. The first thing I did when I started the project was go up to Oregon and spend a few days with Ed's brother Mark. Yes, Joan Leon, who worked at Ed's side for decades, really gave me days and days and days of interviews, and it really helped me. So yes, people close, and I interviewed Judy Human. People close to Ed gave me lots of information.
Ed Roberts died in 1995. He was just 56.
Yeah, he died. I was able to interview the personal attendant who was with him when he died, so I was able to capture and attempt to get the feel of that story. I never met him. This is another challenge as a biographer. Sometimes people who are interviewing me think I must have known him, and I never met him. So it was all reconstructing this man, many, many years later, based on all the information I could put together. Um, but when he died, he was obvious. There were tremendous celebrations. This was, uh, he was an icon. He was uh, an incredible figure. But it also wasn't surprising. He had a weak heart, a heart that had been weakened by the polio itself. He spent much of his life probably not getting enough oxygen. That was the way the doctors would put it. Um, that was a challenge to him.
He lived in an iron lung. What does that mean?
So he slept each night in an iron lung. In the daytime, he had a little ventilator that would send air essentially through a tube, a straw to his mouth. He often had if you look up videos, he has this little straw right on the edge of his mouth, and he kind of, in the middle of a sentence, leans over and lets it force air into his lungs. The iron lung, interestingly, and when Ed first, went into it in as a teenager, it was viewed as a death trap. It was very frightening as an image. Um, Ed Ed really loved it. He found it very he was a cornball. He was very corny, and he said it was his womb with a view. He found it. He said it's warm. I don't have to worry about breathing at all. It does everything for me. In the morning when he woke up, he would do a lot of his phone calls, staying in the iron lung. He'd have the kind of the phone to his ear. His connection, if you can think of the earlier days when people connected by telephone. And that's how he lived his life, was making phone calls. That's how he connected with everything from friends to, congressmen, was through the telephone, and he often did it laying in the iron lung. He found it to be very comforting.
Wow, I couldn't help but think of a parallel. Again, he finds this iron lung comforting. Most people looked at it as something scary. I think that's how today we still see wheelchairs. Wheelchairs are sort of seen as scary, but for people who use them, they're really important, and a lot of people love them who have them.
Yes. Oh, yes. In fact, I hope, we used to have this idea. Journalists would say, oh, confined to a wheelchair, that old confined idea.
Yeah.
And they don't realize what it means to have that mobility. There's a section in the book where I tell about how the power wheelchairs changed the lives of the Cal students. Suddenly, they went from a push chair where they always had someone with them, if you can think of your life that way, to have always somebody with you, to I know the first chairs were not very reliable. They often flipped the students into the creek on campus, but they loved them. I mean, they could
They did. They flipped
could
they
oh they all sorts of mishaps happened, and of course, for the young students, it gave them a chance to get out and zoom around campus and go to parties and do all sorts of hijinks. They raced around the hallways, and these chairs were too fast and too unreliable. And yes, there were lots of mishaps, but it was a freedom. It was a little like I parallel it to the 1920s, when automobiles first gave young people a chance to get away from their parents, and go experience a new kind of independence. Power wheelchairs gave people a real chance to get out and control their own life.
I don't
And
mean to
they
get
still do. They still do today.
Yes, I do. I don't mean to get stuck on this flipping over into the creek, but there is a creek that runs all the way through
Yes.
campus.
Yeah, yeah. And campus is full of hills.
Yeah, it is.
Not a good place for a person using a wheelchair.
Why do you think we haven't had a biography on Ed Roberts until now with yours?
Oh boy, it's hard to say. I'll say this. I think that stories of the movement of disability rights, stories of iconic leaders, I think this has not been a high priority. I don't think it's been a big part of the American story. Um, I don't. It's not in when kids go through school and they learn American history, they don't learn about this. You can in colleges now. Thankfully, we have lots of disability studies programs. There's one at Cal, one at San Francisco State. But I don't think this has really entered into the American story in the way that it should have. And I was very aware of that in writing this. This is such an American story. These are such American characters. This kind of movement, this kind of fight. When I talk to people in other countries, and many other kind of affluent, advanced countries also have some pretty good laws, but they didn't have movements like this. This sort of civil rights fight is part of who we are. So I am still surprised, and I expect by the end of my lifetime we will have some Hollywood movies about some of these leaders, and I expect to be disappointed in these stories because I think they'll turn them into schmaltzy stuff that really isn't representative of who they were. But I'm looking forward to the American story, including, disability activism and folks with disabilities.
Yeah. There are documentaries. I mean, there's Crip Camp, obviously.
Yeah, that was a great breakthrough.
Yeah.
Yes, but one documentary.
Scot Danforth is the Jack H. and Paula A. Hassinger Chair in Education and Professor of Disability Studies at Chapman University. He has joined us for a conversation about his book, An Independent Man, Ed Roberts, and the Fight for Disability Rights. Scot Danforth, I've enjoyed our conversation very much, and I thank you.
Thank you, Mitch. Thank you very much. It's been great to be with you.
That does it for Letters and Politics. I do feel compelled to say here again for all of our radio stations across the country, this is the final week that I am hosting this program, Letters and Politics, and we will not be uploading new programs next week. You are welcome to go to our archive and play past shows as a bridge to get you to whatever you will do next. And for friends who want to stay in touch, you can find my podcast, Letters from Mitch. You can also find me on Substack. Today's program was produced by Deanna Martinez. Kirsten Thomas is the engineer. I'm Mitch Jeserich, and I thank you for listening.
We came so close to our goal, and that's because of you. Thank you for recognizing the importance of this fund drive, especially now as public institutions and free speech come under attack. Your support keeps KPFA independent and strong. If you haven't yet donated, it's not too late. We're still accepting contributions, and thank you gifts are available through Sunday, October 19th at kpfa.org.
You're grooving to 94.1 KPFA, 89.3 KPFB in Berkeley, 88.1 KFCF in Fresno and online at kpfa.org.